Today's episode is a free preview of our sister podcast, To Save Us from Hell. This is the only independent podcast about the United Nations. Co-host Anjali, Dayal, and I are bona fide UN experts. I've covered the UN as a journalist for nearly 20 years. Anjali is a professor of international relations at Fordham University who teaches and researches and studies the UN. And with our powers combined, we bring you insights and analysis about all things United Nations that you simply can't find elsewhere. Full episodes of To Save Us from Hell are available exclusively to paying subscribers. You can get a subscription via globaldispatches.org following the links in the show notes of this episode, or if you're listening directly in Apple Podcasts, you can unlock a subscription in-app. What we're doing with this show is truly unique, and I hope that you will help us keep this show alive and sustain our coverage of the United Nations. Enjoy the episode.
Right now, we're, in a sense, hiding behind a bunch of nice words on paper that are routinely ignored and thrown out the window. So what use are they, actually?
Welcome to Save Us from Hell, a podcast about the United Nations. I am Mark Leon Goldberg, one of your co-hosts. I'm a journalist, and I've covered the UN for like 20 years at this point. I run UN Dispatch and, of course, Global Dispatches, where this very podcast is hosted.
And I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an associate professor of international politics at Fordham University in New York, where I teach and I research and I write about the United Nations.
So later in the show, Anjali and I will discuss a pending Security Council resolution that would back an international stabilization force for Gaza. This kind of international peacekeeping force would not be a conventional blue-helmeted UN peacekeeping mission, but rather a sort of ad hoc mission probably led by Egypt to support the tenuous Gaza ceasefire. We'll discuss what that mission may entail and the politics behind it. Also, following intense American pressure, the International Maritime Organization delayed a carbon pricing scheme intended to reduce emissions from international shipping. Marco Rubio and Donald Trump himself railed against the plan, which appears to have been temporarily sunk. We'll discuss those two issues after the paywall. Go to globaldispatches.org/40% off. That's the word percent, to get a discounted subscription and be able to listen to the rest of this episode. And we do require and depend on your support. For now, however, we are joined by Heba Aly, director of a newly formed group called the Article 109 Coalition, which is named after a provision of the UN Charter, which allows for the review and potential revision of the UN Charter. Heba, welcome.
Hi, Mark. Thanks so much. It's nice to be here.
So, Heba, I have been following your work for ages and ages. I know you and I have known each other for many, many years. And I was intrigued about a year ago over drinks in Geneva when you first seeded this idea in my head about a coalition formed to potentially review the UN Charter. Just to kick off, what is Article 109?
I remember that night, and I think you thought I was crazy at the time.
Maybe still do, but we'll see.
So Article 109 is what I would describe as a pathway for reimagining a new world order without blowing up multilateralism altogether. It is, as you mentioned, a provision included in the UN Charter to review and update the Charter through a general conference that can be held if a majority of countries so wish. And it was essentially a concession made in 1945 when the Charter was being negotiated to the many countries who were opposed to the permanent 5 members of the Security Council having a veto power. So the promise was essentially, this is a particular moment in time. World War II is still raging. Sign up for now. And within 10 years, and the article actually mentions a 10-year timeline, we will aim to revisit this distribution of power and update the Charter. And actually at the time, Harry Truman, who was then the US president, specifically said, this document is not fixed in any mold. It should adapt to world conditions and as it requires readjustment. And our argument would be that time for readjustment has certainly come.
You know, when I first heard this idea from you over drinks over a year ago, I was, a bit skeptical, I'd say. I am less so now after having attended your launch event at the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. There really does seem to be some momentum building towards this idea. Can you just discuss a little bit about how thus far you are intending to put this idea into action?
So, how we're going about trying to actually put this into reality is that I think UN reform is the talk of the town. Everyone's discussing various ideas, but a lot of them don't get at the very fundamental dysfunction of the UN, and a charter review process does. And so we are trying to raise awareness about this pathway for change that many diplomats aren't even aware of. They haven't read that far into the UN Charter. We are trying to help countries overcome initial concerns about the idea of reopening the UN Charter. Many of those are valid, but they do have responses. And I think many of the risks that are perceived can be mitigated. So we walk them through how the process would work and some of the details and the nuance. And then we are looking to create a group of friends of member states, i.e., an informal space in which countries can come together to discuss this, because there isn't really a forum to do that right now. So it's really about mobilizing member states of the UN to engage with this idea. And then separately, we bring together civil society organizations that support the idea of renewing our multilateralism, our world order, the UN Charter, however you want to put it. And at the moment, there are about 40 civil society organizations that range from big groups like Oxfam and Democracy Without Borders to small local organizations in Cambodia to think tanks in Brazil to peace building organizations in Africa that have all kind of come together under this umbrella and a united call for the global governance that we deserve. So we work across the member state mobilization, the civil society mobilization, and then a third pillar of our work is around really framing the conversation and helping normalize the idea of charter reform in the public discourse.
Where did this idea originate? I mean, the article, it's in the UN Charter itself, but in my 20 years of doing this kind of work, I've never heard anyone reference this specific article of the UN Charter until last year.
Yeah, it originated obviously with the drafters of the charter. So, I mean, that's the beauty of this mechanism is that it's built into the UN itself. It was always part of the plan. And so it's actually not crazy at all. It was the intention from the very beginning. But academics have been studying Article 109 for decades. I think what has been missing is political mobilization strategy to actually turn some of those ideas into action. And that's the gap that this coalition seeks to fill. I think also the collapse, you could say, of the current world order that we're witnessing now, the close to rock bottom that we're hitting in terms of the effectiveness of multilateralism, the engagement with multilateralism today, have all also been drivers that I think have accelerated the desire to look for bolder, more ambitious solutions to the challenges that we're facing today. This is an idea that is meeting a moment in a way that perhaps 10 or 15 years ago may not have succeeded, but right now is really gaining steam because of the environment in which we operate and because things have gotten so bad that we need to find a way out of this mess.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on this idea that this is a particularly propitious moment for this kind of movement and actually ask you the reverse question, because a lot of people, a lot of other academics would say this is exactly the kind of moment in which we would not expect a movement like this to succeed. So, what would you say to people who have questions about the political viability of a project that certainly has deep roots in the UN Charter, but ultimately depends on the political will of powerful states that might have real other projects and deep political counter trends to this kind of collaboration?
Yeah, it's a concern that we hear a lot. Isn't this too politicized a moment to try to do this? And couldn't we end up with something worse? I think it's important to remember this process is going to take years. So it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. What we're calling for now is to lay the foundations for that change so that when the political window of opportunity opens, we're ready to leverage it. And that is going to take work. It's going to take movement building. It's going to take awareness raising. And we can't wait until that moment is right to start the work. I think the other thing that's really important to put into perspective when we talk about that is if we do nothing today, what is the trajectory that we're on? So if we continue the status quo as it is, where we have nuclear powers openly threatening the use of nuclear weapons, where we have climate catastrophe with very little signs of progress, where we have increasing conflict and clearly paralysis at the Security Council in terms of being able to actually fulfill its main function of maintaining peace and security, where we have rising inequality, where we have unregulated artificial intelligence that is, threatening our cognitive security. The list goes on and on. So if that is not scary enough to shake us, I think that trajectory that we're on is a much higher risk than the risk of sitting down for an inclusive and structured conversation about what should come next. Clearly, the system we have today is not working and it is collapsing before our eyes. So shouldn't we have a blueprint of what might replace it rather than letting that come as it may and be shaped by God knows which forces? This process allows for that future state to be shaped by everyone together in a way in which those different visions of what the UN should be, and there are different visions, and we should be honest and acknowledge that, can be aired out, and in which we can at least have an honest assessment of where is there common ground today. Right now, we're in a sense hiding behind a bunch of nice words on paper that are routinely ignored and thrown out the window. So what use are they actually?
Let me ask a question from the other side of the follow-up. What makes charter reform the sort of important spot to focus in on when we think about competing visions for the UN's future?
For me, if you look at a lot of the reforms that are on the table today, they tackle one of, we could argue, four things: the structures of the UN. So all this discussion around UN agencies merging would fall in that category, I think. The processes, so the UN Secretary General's discussion on streamlining mandates would fall in that category. Cost savings, the whole effort right now to basically cut and find some savings within the UN's operating system. And then to a lesser degree, I would say maybe culture, right? And here you've heard some discussions about how can the Secretary General be bolder, et cetera. But those aren't dealing with the fundamental, as I said at the beginning, the fundamental dysfunction that is actually codified in the UN Charter itself, which is, to my mind, a few things. One, the veto power that 5 countries have over all other countries when it comes to decisions on security, which we have seen used in opposition to the values of the Charter. And two, a mismatch between the conceptual framing of the Charter, which is really locked into a World War II mindset in terms of how it defines threats to security, in terms of the principles that are foremost. And here I'm referring to national sovereignty, territorial integrity, which remain very important principles, but now need to be balanced with the reality that we live in an interdependent world. And a big part of what I think the UN should be doing today is managing how we protect and provide global public goods. And that's a very different way of thinking than the World War II mindset that has shaped the kind of underpinning of the UN Charter. So until you really deal with those issues, you're not getting to the heart of the problem. And if you think about these underpinnings of our international relations, they were crafted before the internet. They were crafted before the idea of planetary boundaries. They were crafted before the US dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. So a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with today were foreign to the drafters of the Charter. And yet we're still using those World War II tools to try to address them. And so for me, it's like trying to use a typewriter to solve our problems when we live in a smartphone world. It just absolutely needs an upgrade.
So, Heba, I take your point that what you are doing now is try to seed the idea of the possibility of a UN Charter reform process sometime in the future. I guess I'm wondering, when might that be? I worry, say if this were to happen in the next couple of years, we would end up with a far more regressive, say, UN Charter if Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping were leaders of this charge. I would imagine a UN Charter that is less attuned to many of the issues that you articulated earlier. So, when would be a good time to open this up?
That will really depend on governments. We're not in control of the timeline in the sense that it will have to be a vote in the General Assembly that garners 2/3 support that gets this over the line. We have mapped out a proposed roadmap that would see a charter review conference starting in 2030 as part of the post-sustainable development goals framework. That's coming to an end. Everyone is wondering what the new framework for international cooperation is going to be. And this seems like a very good way to have that conversation around what should come next. That would require a vote probably in the next 2 years at the General Assembly in order to leave time for the preparatory process where you'd want to get input and consult with wide swaths of society as to what a revised charter might look like. That's a very ambitious timeline, this 5-year timeline that I'm talking about. It could take much longer than that. It could be accelerated by political events. So it's really hard to say, but I would come back to this idea that this fear of ending up with something worse has held the UN back from change for decades. And actually, I heard those exact words from a former undersecretary general at the UN, who said, because of that fear of something worse, we end up not changing and then we slide into irrelevance. And so we need to measure the risks of what might come out of a conversation around what do we want from the UN with the UN disappearing altogether because it is currently under attack and being pushed further and further into irrelevance. And so we may not have that much time to actually save the UN. And this could be one of the ways in which to do so. The other thing I'd point to is a really interesting comment I heard from Dr. Trita Parsi, who's the executive vice president of the Quincy Institute. And he was asked in an event recently this same question. If we were to reopen the charter today, wouldn't we essentially have authoritarians shaping the view of the world? They were talking specifically about Security Council reform, and that if you had more seats on the Security Council today, you'd probably have more of those seats occupied by countries that are currently led by authoritarian leaders. And he said, we cannot turn the international system into a hierarchy. International law treats all countries equally. If we have a problem with the types of governments we're seeing in the world, that's a problem we need to deal with at home. Strengthen democracy at home rather than holding kind of the international system hostage by saying, no, this isn't the right time for reform because of the kind of visions of the world that might emerge from it. The fact is that those views of the world are shaping the world today, whether we like it or not. And what we're proposing is let's actually sit down at the table and assess where countries sit on this. And the assumption that a majority of countries actually have anti-multilateral views is not supported by the facts. And if you look at the Summit of the Future as an example last year, in fact, a majority of countries rallied together to save the pact and to push for something to come out of that was meaningful. And so I think we do need to question this assumption that a majority of countries would agree to something worse, because that is the threshold we're talking about here. It has to be 2/3 of countries plus all 5 permanent members of the Security Council that would agree to any changes that would emerge. And that's a really high bar to meet.
I do want to say, as a sort of long-term seeding project, the value of it, I think, is absolutely clear. And so too is the sort of idea that there are many more countries that want an active multilateralism. But I do keep getting hung up on this question of power, and that the most powerful states in the UN system do not want this. And I wonder sort of how you wrestle with that in the course of this campaign that's backed so completely by important democratic voices, right? A democracy of people from different kinds of organizations, but that is likely to encounter an anti-democratic but very powerful coalition of obstacles.
I'd say a few things. First, the world is changing and the balance of power in the world is changing. And the powerful, quote unquote, countries recognize that. They're not blind to the fact that they have less relative power than they did at a time in which, there were 2 great powers in the world and they determined all major questions. And so if they are smart, they would see reform of the UN or compromising on some of that power as a way of maintaining the UN as a structure in which they do have relative power as in their interest. Because otherwise, if a majority of countries feel that the UN is simply a vehicle for the major powers to pursue their own interests, they will walk away from it. And we've seen just in this past UNGA, the Kenyan president Ruto threatening to withdraw from the UN if there is no reform of the Security Council. We've seen moves towards BRICS and G20 and all kinds of other groupings because of a perceived ineffectiveness of the UN. And so the powerful countries refuse to relinquish some of that power. The more countries are going to go elsewhere to do their business, and therefore the more their power means nothing because the institution no longer plays any important role. And interestingly, actually, at our lunch in New York, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, said, because I asked him exactly this question, some countries in the West will see that if there is a redistribution of power through a process like this, they will lose relative power, and that's not in their interest. And he said, power is like sand in your hand, and the more you try to squeeze it, the more you lose it. And countries that do proper geopolitical analysis will surely see that. But the other thing I would say in reference to, I think, what you were suggesting at the very end there is that we, the people, the opening words of the UN Charter, have a role to play as well. We have time and again throughout history risen up against abuses of power by our governments, and there is no reason we shouldn't do so at the international level as well. And if a process like this risks being blocked by a handful of countries who are trying to protect their power, the people should hold them accountable and push back against that and make their voices heard and demand that their governments engage in international cooperation responsibly, because all of our futures depend on that. So I think the power playbook is a complex one, but we've grappled with it before, and we have to apply that same mentality to seeing ourselves as having to push back against these powers, even at the international level.
We will certainly be following this issue and your coalition as it progresses over the years. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to Save Us from Hell. The show is co-hosted by me, Mark Leon Goldberg, and Anjali Dayal. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. Our cover art is by Sarah D. Michelle. If you've not already done so, please subscribe to our show via Substack at globaldispatches.org. We are sustaining this show by selling subscriptions to it via Substack. You can get a discounted subscription by going to globaldispatches.org/save us. You can follow the link in the show notes as well. And finally, if you'd like to discuss this episode with us, please visit globaldispatches.org and click on chat, where we'll be around to discuss what we discussed in this episode. Thanks, and be sure to tell friends and colleagues about To Save Us from Hell, a new podcast about the United Nations.